So in my last video, I talked about the tremendous advantages that commercial real estate has over residential real estate. For instance, tenants tend to want a very long-term lease measured in years instead of just 1 year. Often the most frequent question I get from a commercial tenant is, can I please get an extension on the lease? The fact that commercial tenants tend to pay the outgoings, that's how you get the expression triple net lease. It is net of property taxes, insurance, and maintenance, meaning the tenant pays those in addition to their base rent. So from a landlord's perspective, you don't just collect the rent and from that revenue you have to pay those outgoings. No, the tenant pays those in addition to the rent. It makes it far more efficient. And the fact that often if there's an assignment of lease, if they sell the business, it's the tenant's responsibility to find a replacement tenant. And if that new tenant fails to pay the rent, you can go back to the previous tenant to collect the rent. These are all tremendous advantages. I'm not going to go over them here, but we covered 8 of them. And what I want to do in this video is acknowledge that there might be a couple of advantages of residential over commercial, or to put it another way, a couple of disadvantages of commercial relative to residential. And the first one that most people think of is that it seems to be more difficult sometimes to get a tenant for a vacant commercial space than it is to get a tenant for a vacant residential space. In fact, I think everyone would agree that if you've got a house that's vacant and it's been vacant for more than, say, 2 or 3 weeks, there's only one problem with it. It's not that the color of the carpet in the spare bedroom is the wrong shade of gray, or that the aspect of where the sun rises in the morning relative to where the kitchen window looks out upon the garden is wrong. No, there's only one problem, and that is that your rent is simply too high. And if you drop the rent by $100 a month, just to give an example, it might be 50 or 200, depending on what you're starting from. You drop that rent and you will find a tenant. There seems to be a market for any kind of residential property if it meets the market, if it's at the right rental level. Whereas we've all noticed commercial real estate that seems to be vacant even after 6 months. Like you're driving to work and you notice a commercial building and there's this corner shop there. And ever since that the thrift store left or the secondhand shoe shop left, ever since that, you tend to have a lot of vacant space there. Just no one has taken up the space. And I don't know what the solution for that is. Actually, I do. But the solution to the perception that it is difficult actually works in our favor, because everyone else thinks that it's really difficult to get a tenant for that commercial space. And yet we know that that isn't necessarily the case. But hold that thought. The perception is that it can be difficult to get a commercial tenant. And then the second downside of commercial real estate relative to residential in everyone's mind is that in general, whereas banks tend to lend about 80% of the value of a property for you to buy a residential property, when it comes to commercial property, they tend to lend a much lower percentage, typically 50 or 60%. So to put numbers to it, you've got a $100,000 house. Banks might lend you easily 80% of it. Here in the States, they'll lend you 80% before charging PMI, or personal mortgage insurance. And that's not to say that it's possible to get more. I've done many loans at 90%, 95%. There are times in various economies where you can get 100% of the value of a property. And here in the States, the highest I've heard of is 120%. And in the Netherlands in the 1980s, you could even get 125%. And you might think I've gone completely bonkers. And why would a bank lend more money than the appraisal is worth? And the assumption was, firstly, that money was, there was a lot of it. There was a glut of money. So banks really wanted to get the money out into the community. And secondly, they recognized that if you buy a house, you mightn't want to move in straight away. It mightn't be ready for you to move in. You might want to do modifications or changes to it. And in order to make those changes, to make it more livable for you, to make it more suitable for you, you have to spend money to do it. And the bank didn't mind that you spent more than the then appraisal, namely 25% more, because theoretically, when you spend that money on the property, the value of the property goes up. So the new collateral, the new value of the property still covers that 125% mortgage. Be that as it may, that is not the norm. That was an exception, and it happens in various parts of the world at various times. But usually, I think everyone will agree, banks will easily lend 80% of the value of a residential property for you to buy a residential property. Whereas when it comes to commercial, typically they only lend 50 or 60%. So most people who contemplate, no matter how briefly, the possibility of perhaps buying a commercial property, they say, yeah, but, and there are 2 big buts in their mind, but Firstly, it can be really tough to get a tenant. I've seen a building that's been vacant for months at a time, sometimes years at a time. And secondly, even if I manage to get a tenant, banks tend to lend only 50 or 60% of the value of the property. And those two things make it untenable. They make it almost impossible to do a deal. And because it's impossible, they tend to shy away from it and they say, all right, this is too difficult. I'm not going to do it. There's a third one that's related to that. And that is that in general, the value of a commercial building on average tends to be higher than the value of a house. So whereas you can buy a house in today's market for perhaps $200,000, they think that a commercial building might cost them $2 million. And if it's $2 million for a commercial building and it's hard to get a tenant and the banks will only lend me 50% of it, they say it's too difficult and so therefore they stop looking at it. In fact, for you listening to this, you might say, you know what, I agree with that. That's kind of retroactively the reason why I haven't gotten into commercial real estate. Well, that's all good and well. But I have a proposition for you. And that is, if I can debunk those two disadvantages, and perhaps debunk is a strong word, but if I can counter them, if I can give you a different perspective that makes you nod your head and say, I never thought of that, that is true, that makes it no longer a compelling reason not to buy commercial real estate, maybe at that point you'd agree that all the advantages that we've already discussed about, longer lease things, the tenants pay the outgoings, there's less management overhead required, less government interference, all those things might make it extraordinarily compelling for you to get into commercial real estate. So I'm going to have a crack at it right now in this podcast. And let's start firstly with this notion that it can be difficult to get a tenant. The fact that for most people it is difficult to get a tenant actually works in your favor, because we're not talking about averages. You just want to beat everyone else in this market. And if everyone else thinks that it's extraordinarily difficult to get into commercial real estate, whereas it may not be for you, then you've got something over them. You can make commercial deals work that they pass by. And because they're passing them by, the value goes down and the price goes down, and you can buy them for even less money than if everyone invoked what I'm about to explain that you can do. So let's talk about how you might go about finding a tenant. Because most people, when they own a piece of commercial real estate and there's a vacancy there, what do they do to get a tenant? Well, if they're old school, they think, well, we'll run an ad in the paper. And some of you younger people might think, well, let's do the modern day version of that. Let's run an ad online. So you run an ad online, 2,500 square feet, whatever it is, 10,000 square feet, CBD location or good freeway access, a 3-phase power, whatever's relevant. And you put that ad there and you find that 6 months later, you still don't have a tenant. And you can't figure out why. You've been running this ad for 6 months in the publication that everyone says should be normally pretty good. Well, I have a different approach to finding a tenant. So let's create a scenario. Let's say we own a vacant warehouse that is absolutely ugly in a sea of similarly ugly vacant warehouses. So ours is just one of 20 in this area. All warehouses, they all have equally good or bad access to the freeway. They've all got 3-phase power if that's important. And they're all equally ugly. And they're all vacant. You might say, well, this is pretty difficult to get a tenant for these. And my attitude would be as follows. Firstly, who makes the decision as to whether or not to lease our warehouse, or any other warehouse for that matter? Is it going to be the president of the company in the head office in New York or Paris or Los Angeles? No. Is it going to be the coffee or tea man or lady who's going to make coffee and tea for the staff? No. In all probability, the decision as to which warehouse to lease is going to be made by the manager who's going to manage that warehouse. So here's what I do. I spend no more than $10,000. In fact, the amount you have to spend has gone down with time. I spend no more than $10,000 making that manager's office the most salubrious office that any manager has ever seen. In other words, let's imagine we go into this ugly building. It's gray and dark and dingy and horrible. And we go to the manager's office. And it's also gray and dark and dingy and horrible. In fact, there's linoleum on the floor. Well, the first thing we'll do is we'll replace the linoleum with commercial grade carpets. We'll get rid of the fluorescent tubes and put in LED lighting. We'll get rid of the cheap, horrible mechanical locks and we'll put in electronic locks so that he can never forget his keys again. We'll take out the single paned windows and replace them with dual paned or even triple paned windows depending on where it is, how hot it is outside, how cold it gets outside. Not only does this keep the heat of summer out or the cold of winter out, but it also reduces the noise. It's in an industrial area, so there might be a lot of noise there. We're going to put a 60-inch LCD screen, not dissimilar from the one behind me right now, on the wall, and we're going to say it's good for corporate training videos. And we all know that no one's going to watch corporate training videos on these screens, but we've given the manager a great line to use when he's explaining to head office why he happens to have leased our property. And we're going to put a coffee machine there, brewing coffee as people come to look at this building, on the off chance that the manager might actually have a penchant for coffee. And when he smells it, he thinks, man, this is good. This is better than the last 4 warehouses I've looked at. We're going to put a small bar fridge in the corner where he can keep drinks cool for the end of week celebration with all the staff. We're going to put security cameras inside the building and outside, partially for security purposes, partially as a deterrent for potential burglars, and partially also to enable them to monitor the performance of staff or the safety of staff, whatever. All these things are coming down in price. The cost of implementing these is ridiculously small, and yet the impact, you can imagine, when we've decked this office out with contemporary furniture or classical oak furniture or whatever the theme is going to be. Our manager friend, he's already looked at 4 warehouses, each of which is equally ugly and uninviting compared with the other ones he's seen. And then he comes into our building and he opens the door to the manager's office and he sees the carpet and the lighting and the electronic locks and the LCD screen and the coffee machine and the fridge. And he's going to think to himself, whether he wants to admit it or not, holy smoke, if we take on this warehouse, this is where I, the manager, I'm going to spend 40 hours a week for Lord knows how many years to come. And he'll say, I'll take it, before he's even asked the rental. Now, that might be a bit of a stretch. He might want to make sure the rental's the same, but he's going to find out that our rental is no worse or more expensive than the rental on any other warehouse that's similar in size and shape without such a great office. Because it's rented basically on so many dollars per square foot. Our warehouse is whatever size it is, that's the rental. The $10,000 we spent to do up this office is trivial relative to the value of the building. But we will get a tenant almost instantly. And that's why I'm saying the thing that will set you apart in the real estate game is how creative you are. The greater your creativity, the greater your ability to attract tenants or partners or finance or anything. And it works in this game of finding a tenant as well. And that's just one example I've given you. I've had premises that I thought would lend themselves particularly well to a coffee shop because it had a high foot traffic count. It had a driveway that lent itself to people coming up the driveway, ordering through a booth, picking up at another booth, and then taking off again. And try as I might, I did advertise for a coffee shop tenant, and I couldn't find one. And I'm asking you, while you're listening, don't just listen and absorb, but what would you have done at this stage? You've got a place that you think is particularly well suited to a coffee shop, and you've advertised it as such, and you couldn't find a potential tenant. Well, here's what I did. I happened to be a little bit partial to coffee. I didn't mind having to taste coffee, do quality control. So I started one myself. Did I do this because I want to have a coffee shop business? No, not at all. I'm in the game of owning commercial real estate and I want to lease it out to tenants, right? But I did start one. I bought the furniture, the tables, the chairs, the cutlery, the crockery, the barista machine, the fridge, the milk, the supplies, the coffee, you name it. Spent about $25,000 doing it. And I hired the staff to get it up and running. And I ran it for 3 months. And I had 3 months of fun because, as I said, I could do quality control and it's something I don't mind drinking. But then at the end of 3 months, what I could do is I could sell the business. And I wouldn't want to make a living out of creating coffee shops and selling them because I think I sold it for about $30,000 when all was said and done. So I got my expenses back. But as you can probably understand, I sold it with a 5-year lease in place with a right of renewal for another 5 years. In other words, I created a tenant for my own commercial building. All right. And then the tenant, because they saw it as a going concern and it was doing quite well, they were quite happy taking on a 5-year lease. So I created a 5-year lease for myself. So my point is, we said one of the downsides of commercial property relative to residential is that it can be harder to get a tenant. If you don't have a tenant for a house, the only problem is that your rent's a bit high, drop the rent, you'll probably get a tenant. When it comes to commercial, it's not that simple. You can halve the rent or slash it by 75%, and you still may not get a tenant, because getting a tenant for a commercial property requires a bit of creativity. You have to do things to that building to make it appealing. And, just to let you know that I'm not just limited to one decking out a manager's office salubriously, and the other one is creating a coffee shop. There are just so many things you can do that people don't think of. I mentioned that most people advertise somewhere. Why not print flyers, A4 flyers or letter size flyers, whatever it's called here? And don't just print some words on it. We're living, in the 21st century. Make it a color flyer with color photos of the outside of the building and the inside. Put the square footage in, put in the rental amount per foot and the total rent. I mean, people are going to ring to ask you anyway. If you think that by not having that information there, by withholding it, you're going to force them to call you and then you're going to use your charm to talk them into it. No, people just want to know the facts. They need space. They want to run their business. They want to make a profit, and they need a place to run it out of. So I personally put all the information that I think is relevant there, and put your phone number or an email address or anything like that. Put that in there as well. And then with those flyers, go and distribute them. Pay kids to distribute them. Pay them X cents per copy distributed. You've got to be careful here, because you don't want them to say, all right, I'll take 1,000, they get paid for it, and they dump them all in a dumpster, obviously. But go around. And then what I also do is, say I have any kind of business, call it a warehouse again or a distribution center. I will call every other operator of a warehouse or distribution center in the nearest 2.5 miles or whatever radius. You make up the number. Depends how densely populated it is, of course. And I will say, hey, I understand you currently lease a space to do distribution or whatever it is, a warehouse. And they'll probably say, yes, so what? And you say, well, would you mind me asking how many square feet you've got? And let's say they say, well, we've got 3,000 square feet. Just imagine. And let's say that the one we've got is 4,000 square feet. Well, what you can say then is, well, listen, I don't know when your lease comes up for renewal, but in case you're looking at expanding, I have 4,000 square feet nearby that you might want to consider. And chances are they're going to say, no, 3,000 square feet is too much for us. And how did you get our number? And how dare you call us? And don't you ever call me again, or I'm going to call the authorities on you. That doesn't happen. And even if it did, so what? They haven't hit you over the head with the umbrella. And even if they did, it wouldn't hurt that much. But I'm saying it wouldn't happen. So chances are they're going to say, no, thanks for asking, and hang up. But one time in 10, you're going to say, oh my gosh, actually, you're right. We are running out of space and we're looking for new premises. Where is your 4,000 square feet and when can we look at it? Now, there is a chance, of course, that you've got 4,000 square feet, and the people you call, you say, how many square feet do you have? And they have 5,000 square feet. Well, don't say, well, in that case, I'm sorry, we can't do business. What I say then is, well, listen, I don't know if you're looking at shrinking at all, because things are becoming more efficient and volume of trade might be down. But if you're looking at downsizing at all, I happen to have 4,000 square feet. And 9 times out of 10, they'll say, no, that's crazy, go away, don't bug me again. And 1 time in 10, they're going to say, oh my gosh, yes, we are downsizing. We've lost this operation, or we're no longer doing that. And we need a smaller space. When can I look at it? And just on the off chance, because some of you will be saying, well, hang on a minute. What if they say we have exactly 4,000 square feet? Well, what I say then is, well, as a matter of fact, I have 4,000 square feet as well. And I don't know if you're happy with where you are, if the access is good or security, or, whether it's too noisy. We have triple paned windows in our building. And 9 times out of 10, they'll say, no, we're happy. But 1 time in 10, they might say, yeah, well, we'll look at an alternative. We don't like this here, or we don't like that there. The point is, you've got to be proactive. You've got to take steps to let it be known that you've got a place for lease. All right, and don't just, as I said, run an ad in a paper or an electronic version of that. Get a canvas sign made. Make it 4 yards wide and 2 yards high and put "for lease" on it. And then put a phone number or a website. I wouldn't put the address on, because then you can only use it for that building. And this way you can take the sign once you've got a tenant and bring it to another building with the same phone number and or the same website. But let it be known that you've got something available. And what I also do is I'll personally go around and knock on the doors of all the businesses within a certain area. It depends, again, how densely populated it is to decide exactly how big an area it should be. But when you've done that, when you've gone around, you can knock on the door and say, listen, I've got a warehouse, 2,500 square feet, or whatever it is, or it might be a shop, retail shop, or it might be premises that have been used in the past as a restaurant. They're ideally set up a restaurant. It's got the range hood and the extractor fans and you name it, car parking for diners. Before I go to the open market, I just want to put it out there and let people in the local community know that this will be coming on the market soon. And again, 9 times out of 10, maybe 19 times out of 20, people say, well, thanks for letting us know, but no, we're happy where we are, or we're happy with what we've got, or we don't know anyone. But every now and then you'll say, or hear someone say, oh my gosh, my sister's moving to town, or my brother-in-law, and they're starting it, whatever it is, and this would be ideal for them. Would you mind me running it by them? In fact, could you not put it on the market till they've had a look at it? I would love for them to be working. We could commute together. You can fill in the gaps. So you know what I'm talking about. You just need one. And because it sounds unlikely, and even as you're listening to this, you say, yeah, but any one of these situations is a bit unlikely. Yeah, but I've probably given you 10 examples of things that are unlikely, where only 1 person in 10 would do them. But if we've got 10 examples and you've got a 1 in 10 chance of one of them happening, then on average, the expected value is that one of these deals would have gone ahead. And here's the beauty of it. You don't need to find the tenant after you've bought the vacant commercial building. If you find a building that is on the market and it's vacant, you can set about trying to find a tenant before you buy it. I really need you to get the significance of this. There's a vacant building. It's not earning any revenue. The value, it's only $1 million. That's residual land value. But if we can figure out a way of getting a tenant in there and $200,000 a year in rental, and let's assume cap rates at 10%, then that building will be worth $2 million. We haven't bought it yet. We haven't found the tenant yet. But let's say we go looking for a tenant and we find someone who says, yes, I would consider leasing this at $200,000 a year. Well, at that stage, we can do an LOI, or a letter of intent, or a heads of agreement. I've done this often. I came across a funeral parlor. What goes on in a funeral parlor? Well, they process bodies there. Horrible thought in a way. What do? They insert hollow stainless steel tubes into these bodies, and they extract all the blood and replace it with formaldehyde to preserve it a bit. I mean, it's pretty ghastly when you think about it, but that's what goes on. They have a viewing room and a slumber room and a chilling room, and no marks for guessing what they keep chilled there. And when I came across this building, not only was it vacant, but it had been vacant for 3 years. No one knew what to do with it. In an audience, someone once said, well, we'd turn it into a restaurant. And then someone else said, well, I hope it would be vegetarian. So would you have bought it? I certainly wouldn't have. I did end up buying it, but not after I employed someone for 2 straight days to phone every funeral director going further and further from this building, saying, hey, we've got a funeral parlor available. Would you have any interest in operating here? And again, it was worse than 9 out of 10, probably 39 out of 40 said, no way. Just get us off your list. Stop calling us. But then at the end of day 2, the person who I'd engaged to phone the funeral director said, oh my gosh, I've always wanted to operate out of that town. Yes, let me have a look at it. And that's when she put me on the phone, and I said to this funeral director, I said, check it out. If you like it, I don't own it yet. If you like it, I can have a crack at buying it. Now, question for you. Did I run the risk that this potential tenant would say, he hasn't bought it yet? I could buy it. Yes, not only did I run that risk, I actually told it to him. I said, if you want to buy it, you can go ahead. And his answer was exactly what I expected. No, I don't understand real estate. I don't want to own commercial real estate. I know how to run funerals. That's what I want to do. I love this building, but I'd need someone to buy the building for me, and then I can become the tenant. And so he looked at it. He loved it. He said that. I said, well, if you're willing to sign a heads of agreement, an LOI, that's subject to me buying it, you can become the tenant, then I'm willing to have a crack at buying it. And he said, not so fast, Sonny Jim. I'll only do it if you give me a long-term lease. Do you understand the power of this? Commercial tenants want long-term leases. That is phenomenal, guys. That is significant. That is all important. So I would have been willing to have a 5-year lease on the place. 5 years is a pretty good time frame for me. But instead of saying, how about 5 years? I said, how long would you want? And he said, well, I'd like 10 years with a right of renewal for another 10 years. And that's exactly what we did. And this little side lesson here is never be the first to name a figure, because then I probably would have ended up settling for 5 years. So now we had a 20-year lease in place, and I had a happy tenant. And the whole point is, you don't need to own the building before you can go looking for a tenant. Because if I found this empty funeral parlor and I went looking for a tenant, and let's say after 10 days of having someone phone around, I couldn't find anyone who wanted to occupy it, I would say, what a godsend that I didn't buy this building, because if I had, I wouldn't have had a tenant. It would have been a liability for me. But I could find the tenant, almost no chance, it's a small chance, but almost no chance that he would want to buy it from underneath me. And now I had a tenant lined up. I didn't own the building, but I could go ahead and buy this building knowing that it was worth a lot more to me than it was worth to the seller. Right? In fact, when I bought that building, I got the bank to appraise it, and they were very conservative, and they said, yes, but you bought it empty. I said, I know, but I've got a tenant on a 10 plus 10-year lease. Well, they appraised it conservatively at $230,000, and they gave me, I think, a 66% mortgage on it. They gave me $160,000 in the form of a first mortgage, and my purchase price was $170,000. I only had to put $10,000 cash into this deal. To me, that's a great deal. I can't do that with residential. With residential, I have to come up usually with 20%, sometimes more because it's an investment property. And 20% on a $200,000 home is $40,000. And even if you have $40,000, you do it once and your $40,000 is gone. You can't do it again and again and again. So remember the theme of what we're talking about. One of the downsides of residential real estate is that it can be hard to get a tenant. It turns out that embedded in that apparent downside is an actual advantage because it's difficult for everyone else to get a tenant. But if we've figured out a way of getting a tenant, then the value for us is way higher than the value it is to the seller. And the other disadvantage that we'll debunk as well is that banks will only lend 50 or 60%. Well, there are mechanisms like SBA loans, Small Business Association loans. You can get them for 95% if you're one of the tenants in the building. Let's not even talk about that. Let's say that banks max out at 50%. I've just shown you a way where if you can increase the value of a building by doubling the rental, then you double the value. And the bank only lends you 50% of this new value. 50% of the new value is 100% of your purchase price. You've got to understand the significance of this, because when you do, all the advantages we talked about of commercial real estate relative to residential real estate are still there. And the two disadvantages that you all seem to agree with at the beginning of this podcast, namely that it can be difficult to get a tenant, and secondly, that banks lend a lower loan-to-value ratio on a commercial property than on a residential property, they dissolve. I've just shown you a way, many ways, of getting tenants for commercial buildings, and we don't have to commit to buying the commercial building until we've got the tenant lined up, all right? Until they're signed up under a heads of agreement or an LOI. So we've got a guaranteed tenant. If we don't, we just don't contract to buy the building. And secondly, by having the tenant sign up, the value of the property increases in a way that you can't have a residential property increase in value by getting a tenant. It doesn't work that way with residential properties. These are all advantages. I don't know if you catch the excitement of why this is significant, but this is big. This means you can look at real estate that no one else is looking at because their belief is it's too hard to get a tenant and the bank won't lend me enough. Therefore, I need a lot of cash. I don't have a lot of cash. I'm excluded from that market. I've made most of my money in real estate by identifying and finding vacant or semi-vacant commercial buildings. I don't buy them yet. I can't afford to buy them. The banks would only give me 50% of the current value, maybe 60, but that's not enough to take it down. But what I then do is I set about finding or creating a tenant for that space. And by having a tenant there, the value goes up because with commercial real estate, the value of a commercial building is a multiple of its rental income. Or another way of putting it is the rental income divided by the cap rate. So when the value of the building goes up, I then go to the bank with a new appraisal. It sometimes pays to wait a few months if you can finagle a way of having deferred settlement or delayed payment, because if it's too close to when you put the tenant in, they'll say, but yesterday this thing was vacant. Say, listen, we've had a tenant there for 3 months, but if not, say, we've now got a tenant signed up on a 10 plus 10-year lease. And depending on the quality of the tenant, they'll take that at face value. So by getting a tenant in there, the value of the building goes up. They give us a 50% mortgage on the new value. That is equal to the purchase price. You're home and host. You've made it. You're there. It's time to start looking for the next one. It's as simple as this. I love this game. I hope you get it. This is specifically why I think commercial real estate is better than residential real estate. Hope you enjoyed this. Look forward to seeing you again. Until then, I want to wish you, as always, successful investing. Thank you.